I never believed in aliens until one literally crashed into my backyard last Tuesday night. I was sitting on my porch around 11:30, couldn't sleep again, just staring at the stars and thinking about how small we all are in this massive universe. The crickets were doing their usual symphony, and somewhere down the street a dog was barking at nothing. Normal Tuesday night stuff. Then I saw it. A bright light streaking across the sky, getting bigger and bigger, and I thought it was just another meteor until I realized it was heading straight for my property. The impact wasn't what you'd expect. No massive explosion, no crater the size of a football field. It was more like someone dropped a washing machine from a second-story window. The ground shook a little, my coffee mug rattled on the porch railing, and then everything went quiet. Even the crickets stopped. That's when I knew something was really wrong. When nature goes silent, you pay attention. I grabbed my flashlight, the big one I keep for power outages, and walked toward the back of my property where I'd seen the thing come down. My hands were shaking, and I kept telling myself it was probably just a piece of satellite or some space junk. NASA is always saying stuff falls from orbit all the time. But deep down, I knew this was different. The air felt electric, like right before a thunderstorm, and there was this smell I couldn't place, like copper pennies mixed with ozone. The thing that crashed wasn't very big, maybe the size of a small car, and it was nothing like the flying saucers you see in movies. It looked more organic, like a giant seed pod made of some material that seemed to shift between solid and liquid. Parts of it were glowing with this soft blue light that pulsed like a heartbeat. I stood there for probably 5 minutes just staring at it, my brain trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Then a section of it opened. Not like a door opening, more like it melted away and something crawled out. I almost ran right then. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to get out of there, call the cops, call the military, call somebody. But I didn't. Maybe it was shock, maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was because the thing that came out looked like it was hurt bad. It wasn't a little green man or a gray with big black eyes. This being was maybe 7 feet tall when it managed to stand up, thin but not fragile looking, with skin that had a silvery sheen to it. Its eyes were the most human thing about it, except they were purple, deep purple like amethysts, and they were full of pain. I could see it was dying. Green fluid, what I assumed was blood, was leaking from wounds along its side. It looked at me and I looked at it, and for a moment we just stood there in my backyard, two beings from different worlds, neither knowing what to do next. Then it collapsed, just crumpled to the ground like its legs couldn't hold it anymore. That's when something in me kicked in. I don't know if it was compassion or stupidity, probably both, but I rushed over to help. Up close, I could see it was in really bad shape. The wounds looked like burns, and it was breathing hard, each breath making a whistling sound. I tried to remember my first aid training from years ago, but I'm pretty sure they didn't cover alien physiology. I did the only thing I could think of. I ran back to the house and grabbed towels, water, and my first aid kit. When I got back, it was trying to sit up. It looked at the supplies in my hands and made this gesture that seemed grateful. I knelt down and started trying to clean the wounds, having no idea if I was helping or making things worse. The green fluid didn't burn my skin or anything like that. It was warm, warmer than human blood, and had an almost metallic smell. That's when it spoke to me. not with its mouth but directly into my mind. The voice was calm, masculine somehow, and spoke perfect English. It said thank you. Just those two words at first, but they came with this wave of emotion that almost knocked me over. Gratitude mixed with sadness, mixed with something I can only describe as ancient weariness. I asked it what happened, speaking out loud because I didn't know how else to communicate. It told me its ship had been damaged, not by us but by others of its kind. There was a conflict, it said, a disagreement about Earth and humanity. Some wanted to help us, others wanted to leave us alone, and a few wanted to prevent us from advancing further. It was part of the group that wanted to help, and that had made it a target. The being told me its name, though when it said it in my mind, it was more like a feeling than a word. The closest I can come to pronouncing it would be Ashran, so that's what I'll call it. Ashran had been studying Earth for the equivalent of 30 of our years, watching us, learning about us, trying to understand why we were so different from every other intelligent species they'd encountered. I asked what made us different, and Ashran's purple eyes seemed to brighten a little. It told me we were the only species they'd found that had the concept of faith the way we do. Not just belief in higher powers, but faith in things we cannot see or prove. Faith in love, faith in tomorrow being better than today, faith in each other despite all evidence sometimes suggesting we shouldn't. This fascinated them. Ashran was getting weaker. I could see it struggling to stay conscious. I asked if there was anything I could do, any way to help. It told me the wounds were too severe, that its biology was failing. It had maybe an hour or two left. But there was something it wanted to tell me, something it had discovered about humanity that its own kind had refused to believe. It asked me if I knew the story of Genesis from the Bible. I told it I did, though I wasn't particularly religious. Hadn't been to church since my grandmother's funeral 5 years ago. Ashran made a sound that might have been a laugh and told me that was okay, that religion and truth were often different things, though sometimes they overlapped in ways we didn't expect. Then Ashran began to tell me something that changed everything I thought I knew about human history and our place in the universe. It said Genesis wasn't mythology or metaphor, at least not entirely. It was a memory, a cultural memory passed down through thousands of generations, distorted by time and retelling, but containing seeds of truth that were more extraordinary than any fiction. According to Ashran, Earth wasn't humanity's first home. We didn't evolve here, not originally. Humans, or something very close to what we are now, evolved on a planet in a system about 47 light years from here. The planet was called something I couldn't pronounce, but Ashran showed me an image in my mind. It was beautiful, more water than Earth, with 3 moons and rings like Saturn. The gravity was slightly less. The days were longer, and the star it orbited was older and cooler than our sun. This world was paradise by our standards. No predators that could threaten humans, abundant food, perfect climate. Humanity thrived there for hundreds of thousands of years, developing not through technology but through consciousness. They could do things with their minds that we would call impossible. Telepathy, telekinesis, even manipulation of matter at the quantum level. They didn't need machines because they were the machines. But paradise became a prison. Without challenge, without struggle, humanity on this world became stagnant. They stopped growing, stopped learning, stopped caring. Generations passed without any real change or progress. They had become powerful but purposeless, immortal but already dead inside. That's when a group of them made a radical decision. They would start over. They would give up their powers, their immortality, their paradise, and begin again somewhere else. Somewhere harder, somewhere that would force them to grow and change and struggle. They chose Earth specifically because it was hostile but not impossible. It had predators, diseases, natural disasters, ice ages. It would challenge them without destroying them. The process of transferring to Earth and giving up their abilities was traumatic. It required them to basically rebuild their entire species from the genetic level up. They used what Ashran called quantum consciousness transfer, moving the essence of who they were into new bodies designed for Earth. Bodies that were weaker, lives that were shorter, minds that couldn't access the quantum realm directly anymore. Only a small group made the transfer, maybe 10,000 individuals. They arrived on Earth roughly 300,000 years ago in what we now call Africa. They had to learn everything again from scratch. How to make fire, how to hunt, how to survive. Within a few generations, the memory of what they had been was already fading. Within 100 generations, it was legend. Within 1,000, it was forgotten entirely. But the memory never completely disappeared. It got encoded in our myths, our religions, our dreams. The Garden of Eden wasn't a place on Earth. It was the memory of that first world, the paradise we gave up. The fall wasn't a punishment. It was a choice. We chose knowledge and growth over comfort and stagnation. We chose mortality and meaning over immortality and emptiness. Ashran showed me images in my mind as it talked, and I saw things I still can't fully describe. I saw the ships that brought the first humans to Earth, living ships grown rather than built. I saw the ceremony where they gave up their powers, a ritual that looked almost like a mass funeral, everyone mourning the death of what they were to become, what they would be. I saw the first generation born on Earth, smaller and weaker than their parents, but with something new in their eyes. Hope, wonder, the capacity to dream. The tree of knowledge in Genesis, Ashran explained, was a metaphor but also a real thing. It was the moment humanity chose to forget their origins completely, to fully embrace their new existence. Eating the fruit meant accepting mortality, accepting limitation, accepting the full human experience with all its pain and joy. It was the final step in becoming truly human. I asked Ashran why its people were so interested in us if we were just the descendants of another alien race. Surely there were other species out there who had done similar things. But Ashran said no. What humanity did was unique. No other species in their knowledge had ever voluntarily given up advancement for the chance to advance again differently. We were either the bravest or the most foolish species in the galaxy, and they still weren't sure which. What made it even more remarkable was that we were succeeding. In just 300,000 years, a blink of an eye in cosmic terms, we had gone from nothing to space flight. We had developed art, music, literature, science. We had created meaning from suffering, beauty from struggle. We had done something that species with millions of years of advancement couldn't do. We had made mortality meaningful. Ashran was getting weaker by the minute. Its breathing was more labored, and the green fluid had soaked through all the towels I'd brought. I asked if there was anyone I should contact, any way to let its people know what happened. It told me others would come eventually, but not to wait for them. They would know what had happened here. Then Ashran told me something that really shook me. It said humanity was approaching a crossroads, just like our ancestors had faced on that first world. We were developing technologies that could make us like gods again. Genetic engineering, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, life extension. Within a century or two, we could have everything our ancestors gave up. The question was whether we would make the same mistake they did. The danger wasn't in the technology itself, but in how we used it. If we used it to eliminate all struggle, all challenge, all meaning from life, we would end up just like our ancestors did. Powerful but purposeless, eternal but empty. The key was to use these tools to expand human experience, not replace it. To explore new challenges, not eliminate all challenges. Ashran said this was why some of its kind wanted to interfere and others didn't. Some believed humanity needed guidance to avoid repeating the cycle. Others believed we needed to make our own choices, even if they were mistakes. Ashran belonged to a third group that believed in providing information but not interference. That's why it was telling me all this. I asked why me specifically. Why crash in my backyard? Why tell a random person from Ohio these cosmic secrets? Ashran made that maybe laughing sound again and said it wasn't entirely random. It had been monitoring certain genetic lines, people who carried stronger traces of the original quantum consciousness. Not enough to do anything special, but enough to be more receptive to this kind of information. I was one of about 3 million people on Earth who could receive telepathic communication clearly. That didn't make me feel special. It made me feel like I'd won some cosmic lottery I didn't even know I'd entered. I asked Ashran what I was supposed to do with this information. Start a religion, write a book, call the news networks. It told me to do nothing at first. Just think about it, process it, let it settle in my mind. The truth has a way of spreading when the time is right, it said. Ashran then told me about the others who had visited Earth over the millennia. Not just its species, but dozens of others. Some came as observers, some as teachers, some as judges. Many of our myths about gods and angels and demons were actually encounters with these beings. They had influenced human development in small ways, nudging us in certain directions, but never controlling us. That was forbidden by what Ashran called the Universal Accord. The Accord was like the prime directive from Star Trek, but more complex. It allowed for observation and limited contact, but prohibited direct interference in a species' natural development. The only exception was if a species was about to destroy itself and take other worlds with it, which apparently we'd come close to a few times during the Cold War. Ashran told me about one time in 1962 when we almost triggered intervention. Not just the Cuban Missile Crisis, though that was part of it. There was another incident, one that never made it into our history books, involving a Soviet submarine with a malfunctioning nuclear reactor that almost created a chain reaction in the ocean that would have irradiated half the planet. A mysterious technical failure prevented the worst from happening. It wasn't a failure at all. These beings had been protecting us from ourselves, but only from the absolute worst outcomes. Everything else, all our wars and disasters and mistakes, they let happen because that's how we learned. That's how we grew. They were like parents watching a child learn to walk, only catching us when a fall would be fatal. I asked about the crashed ships people claim to have found, about Roswell and all that. Ashran said most were weather balloons and military experiments, just like the government claimed. But a few were real. The beings that crashed were usually young and inexperienced, like teenage aliens taking the family spacecraft for a joyride and getting too close to Earth. The recovered technology had helped advance human science, but not as much as we thought. We were already on the path to discovering those things ourselves. The conversation shifted to what Ashran had learned about humanity that its people didn't believe. It was our capacity for simultaneous contradiction. We could hold multiple opposing beliefs at once and function perfectly well. We could be logical and emotional, selfish and altruistic, cruel and kind, sometimes all in the same moment. Most species evolved toward consistency, but we had evolved to be paradoxes. This paradoxical nature was our greatest strength. It allowed us to adapt to anything, to find solutions no purely logical or purely emotional species could imagine. It's why we could create both nuclear weapons and children's hospitals, why we could write poetry about death while fighting to live, why we could believe in science and magic simultaneously without going insane. Ashran believed this paradox was intentional, built into us by our ancestors when they redesigned themselves for Earth. They knew purely logical beings became cold and calculating, while purely emotional beings became chaotic and destructive. So they created something in between, or rather something that was both at once. We were quantum beings in a classical world, existing in multiple states until observed. The purple eyes were starting to dim. Ashran was dying and we both knew it. I asked if there was anything about the afterlife, if its species knew what happened when we died. It said consciousness was more complex than we understood, that death was a transition, not an ending, but even they didn't fully understand what came next. That mystery existed for every species in the universe. Then Ashran told me one last thing about Genesis, about the true meaning that had been lost in translation and time. The 7 days of creation weren't about God creating the universe. They were about humanity recreating itself. Each day represented a phase of the transformation our ancestors went through to become human. The first day, separating light from darkness, was the decision to give up omniscience for the ability to discover. The second day, dividing the waters, was giving up unity consciousness for individuality. The third day, creating land and plants, was accepting physical needs like hunger and shelter. The fourth day, the sun and moon and stars, was accepting the passage of time, accepting mortality. The fifth day, the fish and birds, was accepting our place in nature rather than above it. The sixth day, creating humans, was the final transformation, becoming fully mortal and limited. The seventh day, rest, was the acceptance of what they had done, the peace that came with the choice. It wasn't a story about the beginning of the universe. It was a story about the beginning of humanity as we know it, told from the perspective of those who chose to become us. Every culture had some version of this story because it was encoded in our genetic memory, in what scientists call junk DNA that isn't junk at all but compressed quantum information waiting to be unlocked. Ashran's breathing was getting shallower. It reached out with one of its hands, which had 3 fingers and a thumb, just different enough to be alien but similar enough to be familiar. I took its hand without thinking, and when I did, I felt everything it was feeling. The pain, yes, but also the peace. It wasn't afraid to die. It had lived for the equivalent of 400 Earth years and had seen wonders I couldn't imagine. But it said dying here, on Earth, holding the hand of a human, was the most meaningful moment of its long life. In those last moments, Ashran shared more images with me. I saw cities floating in gas giants, beings made of pure energy dancing in the coronas of stars, mechanical civilizations that had uploaded their consciousness into planet-sized computers, aquatic species that used sonar to create art we couldn't even perceive. The universe was teeming with life, with intelligence, with beauty and terror and everything in between. But Earth was special, not because we were the most advanced or the most powerful, but because we were the most dynamic. We changed faster than any other species, adapted quicker, dreamed bigger relative to our limitations. In the cosmic symphony, Earth was jazz, improvisational and unexpected, sometimes discordant but always interesting. Ashran's last words to me were about hope. It said humanity's greatest achievement wasn't our technology or our art or our philosophy. It was that we had never completely lost hope, even in our darkest moments. Even when logic said we should give up, something in us refused. That was the gift our ancestors had given us when they chose mortality. Not the fear of death, but the hope for life, for meaning, for something better tomorrow. The purple eyes closed, and I felt the moment Ashran died. It wasn't dramatic, just a gentle release, like breathing out and not breathing in again. The body began to change almost immediately, not decomposing but transforming, becoming lighter, more translucent. Within minutes, it was like holding solidified light. Within an hour, even that was gone, dissipated into the morning air like mist. The ship or pod or whatever it was went through the same process. As the sun came up, it just dissolved, leaving no trace except for a circle of grass that was greener than the rest, more alive somehow. I sat there until noon, just processing everything I had experienced, wondering if I had imagined it all. But I knew I hadn't. The knowledge Ashran had shared was too detailed, too consistent, too far beyond anything my mind could have created on its own. I had been given a gift, or maybe a burden. The truth about humanity, about our origins, about our purpose. The question was what to do with it. I went back to my normal life, or tried to. Went to work, paid my bills, watched TV. But everything felt different. I would look at people on the street and think about the quantum consciousness sleeping in their DNA. I would read the news about wars and disasters and think about the species watching us, debating whether to intervene. I would lie awake at night staring at the stars, knowing they were full of life looking back. For weeks, I told no one. Who would believe me anyway? Even I sometimes wondered if I had experienced some kind of breakdown, a vivid hallucination brought on by stress or lack of sleep. But then things started happening that confirmed it had been real. I began having dreams, except they weren't really dreams. They were memories, but not my memories. Memories from that first world, from our ancestors who gave up paradise. I saw their cities that grew like gardens, their art that existed in dimensions we can't perceive, their science that was indistinguishable from magic. But I also saw their emptiness, their ennui, their desperate search for meaning in a world where everything was possible and nothing mattered. In one dream, I witnessed the debate that led to the exodus to Earth. It wasn't unanimous. Many thought it was insane to give up everything they had achieved. Others argued it was the only way to save their species from a slow spiritual death. The ones who came to Earth were considered either visionaries or fools, depending on who you asked. Even now, Ashran had told me, that debate continued among those who remembered. The dreams also showed me things about Earth's history that we had gotten wrong. The pyramids weren't just tombs or monuments. They were markers, geometric signals visible from space that said intelligent life was here. Stonehenge and other ancient sites were the same, a planetary network of beacons that announced humanity was ready for contact. We just forgot what they were for. I learned that certain bloodlines carried stronger genetic memories than others, which explained why some families seemed to produce multiple generations of mystics, prophets, and visionaries. They weren't seeing the future. They were remembering the past, the deep past, the cosmic past that most of us had forgotten. About 2 months after Ashran died in my backyard, I started noticing others. People who had had similar experiences, who had been told similar things by dying visitors or received the same information through dreams. We found each other online, carefully, cautiously, using coded language and metaphor. There were maybe 100 of us worldwide, all trying to make sense of what we had learned. Some wanted to go public immediately to share the truth with humanity. Others thought we should keep it secret, that the world wasn't ready. A few believed we had been chosen to prepare humanity for what was coming next, though none of us knew exactly what that was. We argued and debated, just like our ancestors had on that first world. I began to understand why Ashran had told me to do nothing at first. The information needed time to settle, to integrate, to find its natural path into human consciousness. Forcing it would only create resistance, disbelief, maybe even panic. The truth had to emerge organically, like a seed growing into a tree. Strange things kept happening. I would think about a specific aspect of what Ashran had told me, and then I would randomly meet someone who would mention something related, or find a book that contained a piece of the puzzle, or have another dream that explained more. It was like the universe was drip-feeding me information at exactly the pace I could handle. One of the most profound realizations came about 3 months later. I was reading Genesis again, looking for more hidden meanings, when I noticed something about the serpent in the garden. In the original Hebrew, the word used could mean serpent, but could also mean shining one or messenger. What if the serpent wasn't a devil, but another being like Ashran, offering humanity the choice to fully commit to their new existence? The fruit of knowledge wasn't a trap. It was a graduation ceremony. By choosing to eat it, by choosing knowledge and mortality over ignorance and immortality, humanity proved it was ready for the next phase of existence. We passed the test by failing the test, which was such a perfectly human paradox that it had to be true. I also began to understand why this knowledge was being shared now. Humanity was approaching another choice point. In the next century, we would have the technology to reverse what our ancestors did. We could enhance ourselves back into gods, eliminate death, suffering, all limitation. The question was whether we would remember why our ancestors chose differently. The danger wasn't the technology itself, but losing what made us human in the first place. Our struggles, our mortality, our limitations weren't bugs to be fixed. They were features that gave life meaning. Without death, life had no urgency. Without pain, joy had no context. Without ignorance, discovery had no thrill. We could enhance ourselves without losing ourselves, but only if we remembered why we chose to be human. 6 months passed. I returned to normal life mostly, but with this hidden knowledge always in the background. I would go to work and think about quantum consciousness. I would watch the news and wonder what the watchers thought of our latest crisis. I would talk to friends and family and want so badly to tell them what I knew, but I held back. The time wasn't right yet. Then one night, I had a different kind of dream. Not a memory, but a communication. It wasn't Ashran, but another of its kind. It told me others would be coming soon, not to invade or control, but to reveal themselves. Humanity was almost ready for open contact, but first, we needed to understand our true history. That's why beings like Ashran had been sharing this information with people like me. The revelation wouldn't come from governments or scientists. It would come from ordinary people sharing extraordinary experiences. Stories would spread, patterns would emerge, and gradually humanity would remember what it had forgotten. Some would resist, some would deny, but enough would remember, and that would be enough. This being also told me something Ashran hadn't. The transformation our ancestors went through wasn't unique to humanity. Every advanced species reached a point where they had to choose between godhood and meaning. Most chose godhood and eventually stagnated or destroyed themselves. A few chose meaning and continued to evolve. Earth was an experiment in extreme meaning-making, pushing the concept to its absolute limit. We were, in essence, the universe's attempt to understand itself through limitation. By becoming mortal, by accepting suffering and ignorance and death, we created the maximum contrast between what we were and what we could become. That journey, that story, was what gave existence meaning. We were the universe telling itself the most dramatic story possible. I learned that consciousness itself was fundamental to reality, not an emergent property of complex brains, but the foundation everything else was built on. Matter was just consciousness slowed down enough to seem solid. Energy was consciousness in motion. Space and time were consciousness creating a stage for experience. We hadn't evolved consciousness. Consciousness had evolved us as a way to experience itself. This explains so much about human nature, why we seem to have capabilities our brains shouldn't support, why placebos worked, why meditation could alter reality, why prayer sometimes seemed answered. We were unconsciously accessing the quantum consciousness that underlies everything. The same power our ancestors had given up but which still existed dormant in our DNA. Some humans were beginning to naturally reawaken these abilities. Not fully, not to the godlike level of our ancestors, but enough to prove that the potential still existed. The children being born now were different, more connected, more aware. They would be the bridge generation between what humanity was and what it would become. The choice we faced wasn't whether to become gods again, but what kind of gods to become. Would we be the stagnant, purposeless gods our ancestors had been, or would we find a way to maintain meaning while expanding our capabilities? Could we become gods who still struggled, still grew, still found wonder in existence? A year passed since that night with Ashran. I finally started writing about it, sharing it carefully, anonymously at first. To my surprise, many people resonated with it. They had felt this truth somehow, even without direct contact. It was like I was reminding them of something they already knew but had forgotten. Scientists started finding evidence that supported parts of what I had learned. Genetic studies showing humanity had gone through an extreme bottleneck around 300,000 years ago. Quantum physics experiments demonstrating consciousness could affect reality at the subatomic level. Archaeological discoveries of advanced technologies that shouldn't have existed when they did. None of it was proof exactly, but it was all pointing in the same direction. Humanity was more than we thought we were, older than we believed, and part of something vastly larger than we had imagined. We weren't alone, had never been alone, and were approaching a moment when that would become undeniable. The governments of the world knew some of this, of course. They had their own contacted individuals, their own recovered artifacts, their own pieces of the puzzle. But they were as confused as everyone else about what it all meant. The truth was too big for any one government or organization to control. It had to emerge from humanity as a whole. I thought about Ashran often, about those purple eyes full of ancient wisdom and deep compassion. It had died to bring me this message, had sacrificed itself so humanity could remember who we were. That sacrifice meant something. It meant we were worth saving, worth teaching, worth believing in. The green grass where Ashran's body had dissolved never changed color, even in winter. It stayed vibrant and alive, a small circle of perpetual spring in my backyard. I would sit there sometimes, especially on clear nights, and look up at the stars. Somewhere out there, Ashran's people were watching, waiting, hoping we would make the right choice. Because a choice was coming. Not today, not tomorrow, but soon in cosmic terms. Within the next few generations, humanity would have to decide what it wanted to become. We could transcend our limitations and risk losing our humanity, or we could embrace our limitations and risk stagnation. Or maybe, just maybe, we could find a third path. That third path was what Ashran believed in. Not abandoning our humanity to become gods, and not clinging to mortality out of fear, but consciously choosing which limitations to keep and which to transcend. We could eliminate involuntary suffering while keeping voluntary challenge. We could extend life without eliminating death. We could expand consciousness without losing individuality. It would require wisdom we hadn't developed yet, compassion we hadn't fully learned, and courage we weren't sure we had. But we had done impossible things before. We had chosen mortality over godhood, meaning over power, growth over comfort. We could make the right choice again. The revelation of our true history wouldn't come as a shock announcement or an alien invasion. It would seep into human consciousness slowly, naturally, like water finding its way through rock. Some would accept it immediately, others would take generations. But eventually, humanity would remember who we were, where we came from, and why we chose this difficult, beautiful, meaningful existence. I still live my normal life. I go to work, pay my bills, watch movies, laugh with friends. But underneath, I carry this cosmic secret, this incredible truth about humanity. We are the universe's bold experiment in meaning-making through limitation. We are gods who chose to become mortal so we could truly live. We are the paradox that makes existence worthwhile. Sometimes I doubt it all, wonder if I just imagined that night with Ashran. But then I look at that circle of green grass that never fades, and I remember those purple eyes, and I know it was real. The truth is written in our DNA, in our myths, in our dreams. We are more than we know, less than we were, and exactly what we chose to be. The story isn't over. In fact, it's just beginning. Humanity is waking up from a 300,000-year sleep, starting to remember who we really are. The childhood of our species is ending and adolescence is beginning. It will be turbulent, confusing, sometimes terrifying. But on the other side is something magnificent. A humanity that consciously chooses its own evolution, that writes its own cosmic story, that proves meaning can triumph over entropy. Ashran said we were unique in the universe, the only species that had voluntarily chosen mortality. But I think we're about to become something even more unique. The only species that chose mortality and then consciously chose how to transcend it without losing what mortality taught us. We're going to become mortal gods, limited infinities, finite beings with infinite potential. The watchers are waiting to see what we decide. The universe itself is holding its breath, because what humanity chooses will ripple across space and time, affecting species and worlds we can't even imagine. We're not just choosing for ourselves, but for consciousness itself, for the future of meaning in an otherwise meaningless cosmos. I don't know if anyone will believe this story. It sounds crazy even to me sometimes, and I lived it. But maybe that's the point. The truth is often stranger than fiction, and the strangest truths are often the most important. We are living in a universe far more incredible than we ever imagined, and we are far more incredible than we ever knew. So what do we do with this knowledge? How do we prepare for what's coming? Ashran said to do nothing at first, and I followed that advice. But now I think the answer is simpler and more profound. We live. We fully embrace this human experience with all its pain and joy, all its limitation and potential. We love deeply, dream wildly, struggle meaningfully. We become the best humans we can be because that's the whole point. Our ancestors gave up paradise so we could create meaning. They gave up perfection so we could grow. They gave up immortality so we could truly live. The least we can do is honor their sacrifice by living fully, consciously, courageously. By choosing growth over comfort, meaning over ease, love over fear. The alien in my backyard told me the true meaning of Genesis, but really it told me the true meaning of humanity. We are the universe's way of experiencing limitation and transcendence simultaneously. We are the impossible made possible, the infinite made finite, the eternal made temporary. We are gods pretending to be mortal, and that pretense has become our greatest truth. Every human walking this earth carries the dormant potential of godhood in their DNA. Every struggle we face is a choice to grow. Every moment of suffering is an opportunity for meaning. Every death is a reminder of why life matters. We are living stories, walking paradoxes, breathing miracles that don't even realize how miraculous we are. The beings watching us from the stars aren't judging us. They're learning from us. We're teaching the universe that limitation can be a gift, that mortality can be meaningful, that choosing to struggle is sometimes braver than choosing to transcend. We're the cosmos's experiment in extreme meaning, and so far, we're succeeding beyond anyone's wildest expectations. Ashran's people will return eventually, not to conquer or control, but to welcome us into the larger community of consciousness that spans the galaxy. But first, we need to finish what we started. We need to complete the human experiment, to fully explore what it means to be consciously limited beings in an unlimited universe. That night changed me forever, not in some mystical way where I suddenly developed psychic powers or started seeing auras. It changed me in a quieter, deeper way. I see purpose where I used to see randomness. I see connection where I used to see isolation. I see meaning where I used to see emptiness. The universe isn't a cold, dead place where consciousness is an accident. It's a living, breathing organism where consciousness is the whole point. When I told you at the beginning that I didn't believe in aliens until one crashed in my backyard, that was true. But now I realize the question wasn't whether aliens existed. The question was whether we were ready to remember that we are all aliens, all visitors to this world, all participants in the greatest experiment ever attempted. We are strangers who chose to forget we were strangers, so we could truly become natives of this beautiful, difficult planet. The truth about Genesis isn't that God created humans. It's that humans chose to become human. We wrote our own origin story and then forgot we were the authors. But now we're starting to remember, and with that memory comes responsibility. We can't pretend to be victims of circumstance anymore. We are the architects of our own limitation, and therefore the masters of our own transcendence. So if you're listening to this, if you've made it this far through my story, know that you're part of something incredible. You carry the seeds of godhood in your cells and the memory of paradise in your dreams. You are both mortal and eternal, limited and infinite, human and divine. The contradiction isn't a mistake. It's the whole point. You are the universe experiencing itself subjectively, and your life, however ordinary it might seem, is part of the greatest story ever told. The dying alien in my backyard revealed the true meaning of Genesis, and now I've shared it with you. What you do with this knowledge is up to you. Maybe you'll dismiss it as fiction, and that's okay. Maybe you'll feel something stir deep inside, a recognition of truth you've always known but couldn't name. Maybe you'll be like me, caught between skepticism and belief, living a normal life while carrying a cosmic secret. But whatever you choose, remember this. We are not alone, we never were, and we're approaching something wonderful and terrifying. The childhood of our species is ending. What comes next depends on the choices we make, individually and collectively. Choose wisely, choose courageously, and above all, choose consciously. Because we are the universe choosing what it wants to become, and that choice matters more than we can possibly imagine.